teacher pulled my parents aside, asked that I repeat the second grade. All of us have been shamed at some point in our life for asking like a stupid question. Questions are one of the key access points to tapping into our curiosity. It's not a disorder, it's the system that's actually disordered. And we're not actually building in time to process information and experiences. So our brains gravitate towards this low energy state, meaning that we're not coming up with new ideas. People have different algorithms for how they think and how they approach things.
Welcome to the Vitalist Podcast, where healing meets wonder. This is your space to gain transformative knowledge, deepen your mind-body connection, and awaken your human spirit. If you're ready to connect with your innate potential, embrace life's challenges, and expand what you believe is possible, this is the place. Get ready to slow down, be moved, and live like a true vitalist.
Well, I'm here with Dr. Jeff Karp, who leads a lab at MIT and Harvard, and he has 170 published review articles and 35,000 citations. So he's super accomplished in his field, but I think when we hear his story, it's one that might surprise you. So I would love for you, Dr. Jeff, to take us back to second grade and give us a glimpse into how your academic journey started.
Yeah, second grade was quite a struggle for me. I would sit at the back of the classroom and just feel like I didn't belong, like an alien in a way. Nothing that the teacher was saying was ever landing. Everybody else seemed to get it, and I wasn't getting it. I also wasn't very socially connected, and so it was quite a struggle. So much so that at the end of the year, the teacher pulled my parents aside and asked that I repeat the second grade. And my parents negotiated for me to spend the summer catching up with tutors in order to go on to the third grade, and the teacher agreed. So all my classmates went on vacation, and here I am in summer school. But on one particular day, they asked me a question that literally changed my life and really was the beginning of LIT, Life Ignition Tools. So what happened was, just seemed like any other day I went in, the tutor read a passage, asked me some questions, I gave answers, pretty quickly without, I never really sort of thought deeply about things. It just sort of said what was ever on my mind. I was kind of an impulsive kid. But on this particular day, the tutor paused after I gave my answers and looked me in the eyes and asked, "How did you think about that?" And nobody had ever asked me that question before. And I guess it kind of felt, remembering back, a little bit violating in the sense of I didn't know what to answer. Like, that really sort of stumped me. But coming away from that experience, I started to think about thinking. Like, it was actually this somewhat magical moment in my life where I started to embrace this concept of metacognition at the age of 8. And I think the reason why it really resonated with me was because at the time, I was struggling so much, and I was in a truly survival mode in school. And I wanted to do better. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to be like the other kids. And so what I did is, it was almost like the computer analogy, where I felt like I knew I had this like hardware, but I didn't have software that was working for me. And I realized I needed to program that software myself. And so what I mean by that is I would observe what other children said in different situations, and then I would try that on. I would repeat what they would say. So I was always listening, always analyzing. After that experience with the tutor, I really started to tap into my powers of observation and pattern recognition. And I started to realize that my way of learning was not sitting in a classroom listening to a teacher. My mind would just, they would say something, and all of a sudden, they'd tell a story, and there'd be something about, like a cow or a horse, and then that's all I would think about, and I would miss everything else that was said. My way of learning that I figured out was through asking questions, because I noticed anytime I asked a question, I could hyper-focus on the answer for a few moments, and then it would imprint in my mind, and I could recall it later. I could connect it to other things in my mind. And so what happened essentially was after this experience with the tutor, in between the second and third grade, I just started focusing my thoughts almost entirely on pattern recognition and observation and then experimentation. And I was still, I still would get like very immobilized. I was a C&D student, so anytime the teacher asked a question, like on a test or, whatever it was, an assignment, I always found it very vague. Like I could think of many possible answers and I didn't know which one they wanted. And so that would actually prevent me from starting assignments. So I couldn't do anything. And my mom would sit with me and try and interpret things and help me along. But I would literally shut down. Like that was one of the big challenges that I faced all the time. And then in the 7th grade, my mom, that the school kind of refused to do anything, and ADHD and learning differences weren't really a big thing back then, so there weren't that many resources. So my mom went up against the school board on her own and demanded they take a look at my file. She had captured everything teachers had said about me and all my grades and comments, and I was called lazy a lot and a lost cause, and teachers would ask me, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I'd say, I want to be a doctor. And they would say, well, you better set your sights lower because you just don't have what it takes. And so that I was constantly kind of getting those kind of comments. But my mom detailed all the struggles and things that I had gone through. And she went to the Board of Education, and they agreed that I was eligible for accommodations. I got identified as having learning differences, diagnosed with ADHD, so that gave me extra time and space. And then my grades went from C's and D's to straight A's because I finally had the time that I needed to figure out, questions that I was being asked and what's the highest probability answer that the teacher was actually looking for. And so that was part of the method or the process that I had to engage and navigate through the early days of my schooling.
In your book, you wrote, "School is a museum of ideas." What do you mean by that?
I don't know. I just feel like learning for me, the most profound learnings have come from experiential, things, right? Like actually being out in nature, or actually being in some sort of a factory, or being somewhere where someone's doing the thing. And, I'm observing intently, and then it's almost like a problem-based approach because you're so curious about what's happening here, and what's ever being said is you're just listening so much more intensely. Whereas I feel like school is in many ways kind of more algorithmic, based on it's just this information that is not really living. It's like it just seems like it's confined, it's constrained, it's sort of similar to if you were to go to a museum, and which can be interesting, but because you don't have that evolution, you're not connected directly to the problems or to the experiences. It's not a full body experience. It's more like you're just looking at something or listening to something. Whereas I feel like when you're truly learning in the real essence of the word, it's like all of your senses are being activated. Whereas I feel, often in museums, there's limited senses that are being activated, and that's kind of how I felt.
When you were given the label attention deficit disorder, did that resonate? And how did that anchor an identity in you that you had to overcome?
Yeah, it really did resonate for me because because I'd spent so much time, thinking about thinking and thinking about the algorithms in my mind, thinking about, how things worked, what caused me to, and by the way, with the ADHD, like I connect with both the the attention side of things, and the H, the hyperactivity side of things. And so I think that label was very helpful to me in the sense of it kind of made me feel like, oh, that's what's, it kind of gave, instead of just being this odd, kid who was struggling and didn't get it. It gave me something to grab onto, like some sort of a foundation that I could, like it helped with understanding. I don't know. I feel like in life, often we struggle when we don't have a certain grounding, and we may hear like a quote, or we may hear somebody just say one sentence or a really short line, or it could even be like a word, and it just gives us an anchor point of understanding. And I think when we don't understand something, it can really be confusing, especially when it relates to your identity or, some of the struggles that you're going through. If you can't really figure out the source of it or have some idea, it becomes really challenging to navigate the world. And so I think that label was grounding for me. I don't actually like the label because I don't think that it is a disorder at all. I really think of it as more of like a on the neuro, sort of typical or atypical spectrum. It's just like a region of that spectrum, and that everybody has different ways of experiencing the world, ways of engaging, ways of directing their attention, either for long periods or short periods, or ways of jumping around. I tend to think that people who have ADHD, tens of thousands of years ago would have been the ones in the tribe that would have been able to notice patterns that could help the whole tribe survive, right? Like, this ability to have your attention jump around really quickly, could help you spot potential dangers, or be able to recognize changes in patterns very quickly. And so to me, what potentially was a very important asset in our survival years ago is now being referred to as disorder. And I think the reason is because it's actually the system's disorder. The system is designed for people to be sitting down in a very sterile environment where almost nothing changes around you. Like the paint on the wall is not changing, whereas outside everything's changing every day, like the direction that plants are facing and the colors and, everything's changing, the sky and the ground and everything. It's really, I think the school system is designed for a very particular type of student who is able to receive information from a single source while sitting down for long periods of time, and have very few senses be activated, in that process. And so to me, I think it's not a disorder, it's the system that's actually disordered, and that we need to really spend more time thinking about the environments that'll be conducive for people to identify and cultivate their gifts.
In your book, you wrote about how neurodiversity is similar to biodiversity, and it builds this resilience, and I absolutely admired that because it's so true. And I feel like when people are put on these labels, they think there's something wrong with them because they're not like everyone else.
Exactly. And that's what, it's, I love that you brought that up, because I think that in today's day and age, even with, AI, the large language models, whether it's like Gemini or ChatGPT or Perplexity or Grok or, all the ones that people are using, it's essentially homogenizing our writing and our thinking, and I think probably also our brain structures are getting more homogenized, and some data is starting to come out on that. And I think that we're essentially losing that authenticity, that unique way that we all show up in the world and observe the world and report back. And to me, one of the sort of most exciting things about life is curiosity. And I think that curiosity is piqued by the different experiences that we all have. And when we start to share those experiences with each other, we have this natural tendency to be engaged and feel deeper connections with people when we're learning about others and hearing about, things that are non-obvious to us or things that are different from our experiences. And so I think when we start to homogenize those experiences, we tend to dull our curiosity, which I think is really sad, and also can get us into a lot of trouble, because then, when our curiosity is dulled, we show up in the world in a much, in a potentially negative way. And it can lead to a lot of illness and mistreatment of other people. And, because when you're curious and you're following your curiosity, you have all these neurotransmitters which are being released in your brain, which, make you feel good and help you connect more deeply with others. And so when our curiosity is dulled, we start to sort of dull access to those neurotransmitters in those situations. And so we tend to then be much more alone, maybe fearful, have more social anxiety, those types of things.
Is that what inspired you to write your book, Lit, Life Ignition Tools?
What happened was, actually in 2017, I think it was, an editor from New York reached out to me, Heather Jackson, and she saw an article on my lab work, my research work on bioinspiration, where we turn to nature to help us overcome challenges in our projects, essentially. So, we look at snails and slugs and geckos, and we look at like spider webs and all kinds of different creek jellyfish. And through learning from nature, it helps us to bring in new ideas that can help us solve problems. And so Heather was interested in, hey, would you be interested in writing a book about that? And I know that I get excited very quickly and tend to say yes immediately, but so I've been sort of working on that, to pause. And so I took a few days and I thought about it, and I realized that while I want to write about that, what was more of a burning desire within me was to write about the tools that I developed and share them with other people. And so that's where really the motivation, the passion for putting Lit together, kind of came about. And it ended up taking 7 years to write the book. And I actually interviewed 40 people for the book as well, including Nobel Prize winners, Olympic medalists, social justice leaders, an indigenous leader, and the 6-time US memory champion, and then lots of people from my lab and CEOs, and really just asked people, like, how do you be intentional in your life? Like, what's your process for doing that? And so I share those stories as well.
I would love to unpack a few of the tools that you write about in the book. I think one of the things that is interesting to me is how our attention has become the product of the system we live in. And so what is your favorite tool to give people when our attention has been hijacked, to regain that attention so that we can ignite our own curiosity, because it has been dulled by just the system that we're living in, the logarithms, everything?
One of the things that I notice is that if I go online a lot, our eyes are generally on the screen kind of jumping around, all over the place, right? Like if you go on YouTube, for example, it's always suggesting other videos on the side, right? So your eyes are kind of trained to be jumping around, and, on all these social media sites, or if you go on like CNN or these news sites, there's so many things happening at once. And so when then I go outside, I notice that my eyes are kind of doing the same thing, right? Like they're jumping around like everywhere. My attention's all scattered all over the place. And what I've been practicing as one of many things, which people, listening today can try, is I try to hone in on individual senses. Let's say when I'm walking in the neighborhood, and really try to block out the other senses. And when you do that, it's almost like doing a bicep curl for that sense. So you're kind of strengthening that pathway, that connection. So, for example, I might be walking around my neighborhood and I'll say sight, and then I'll look at the texture of the bark on the trees. And I'm not just looking at it, I'm looking at the patterns. Like I'm really focused on it. I'm trying to connect it, not just observing it, but sort of letting my imagination take over as well, and be like, oh, that looks like a river, or that looks like clouds, or those look like animals, or, things like that. So you kind of just focus in. It takes a little bit of time, like a few times before you can really, some people can tap into it right away, but it's really captivating you in a way that allows you to be like you're essentially training your attention via sight.
How has that allowed you to become more embodied? So when you're going on your walk and you're seeing the tree bark, do you just see it through your eyes, or are you trying to feel that in your body as well? Or do you try and feel the sounds, not just through our ears, but through our bodies?
Well, what I have noticed is since I've been doing this for a while, when I'm walking around the neighborhood, now I don't just look at the bark of the trees, it actually captivates me, right? So like, it's like now I don't just look, I actually like, I'm in, you know, like, and I think that it's a huge unlock, like multiple unlocks start to happen when you focus your attention, especially in nature, and you start to let your imagination sort of, run, and let your curiosity start to flow. And all of a sudden, I don't know, for me, like I start to feel more connected to the trees. I start to appreciate, start to have gratitude for the trees. I start to become really curious about like what's going on and why are these patterns there and how is that helping the tree and what is it using it for? And I feel like when my curiosity starts running wild like that, and I am so captivated by the tree, and it's like, periods of awe, or like I'm experiencing, then it becomes a fully embodied experience, because it's like, like there's so many aspects of it, right? Like what are trees, and they came from the ground, and what are they doing, and why are they reaching for the sun, and right, like all these things. We have scientific answers for a lot of them, but to me, science is only part of our knowing, and there's other aspects of knowing that like science can't really explain at all how you get from simple molecules to life. There's no scientist on the planet that actually understands that. We all talk about how like DNA is the blueprint for life, but what's the blueprint for DNA, right? And it's really just like small molecules, and how does those molecules come together? And a lot of people believe that maybe, it's just like chance, like, these molecules kind of assembled. But I think, I don't know, like if you're living, right, and you're sort of looking out at the world, I don't know, I feel like it's hard not to tune into something beyond just chance, sort of interactions. And so to me, kind of bringing it back to the tree, I just feel like there's something really magical and mystical there, and I would keep reminding myself that like I'm just seeing that tree at a snapshot in time. Like the tree is actually moving, like it's moving around, and it's growing, and it's dynamic, and it looks, when we just go outside, our brains trick us to think that's the tree, and that's the way it's going to look every day. But every moment it's different, it's completely changing, and nutrients are being transported, and it's growing in all these directions, and it's angling more towards the sun. And so to me, it's like tapping into that dynamic aspect of life.
In terms of creativity, curiosity, connection, I almost see them as human resources, and you write about them in your book as sort of similar to natural resources, is that they're buried very deep within. What's another tool that someone can use to uncover this natural resource within them? Because in our studio, people will often say, even my friends, I'm not creative.
There's a lot of tools that can get us there, and I feel like it's often dependent on what a person, sort of the state that they're in, or sort of the context of how they're showing up in the world. And to me, it's sort of like, if we take one example, let's say like questions, right? So all of us have been shamed at some point in our life for asking like a stupid question or a bad question, and the problem is that questions are actually one of the key access points to tapping into our curiosity, which actually feeds into creativity. And I think, for example, because we've been shamed for asking questions in the past, we not only hesitate to ask questions today, but we have sort of dulled our evolution of question asking, because I think questions are actually a skill that we can get better at over time. And so I'll give you an example. When I got to my PhD at University of Toronto, I started to attend these invited lectures. So, academics do this very frequently where, once a week or once a month, whatever it is, invited lectures come in, you sit there and you listen to them. And then there's this question and answer period at the end. And so what happened is that I would go to these lectures and sort of dozing in and out a little bit because of my, ADHD, and get to the end, and I was just amazed at the questions that people were asking. Like, it was almost like the arrows were flying, in the room, and the questions were cutting right to the core of what that presenter had said. And in academia, things can get sometimes nasty, not always, but sometimes they can get nasty. People asking very invasive questions, but a lot of the questions are actually really important questions. And I just remember sitting there thinking to myself, and this was back in 1999 when I started my PhD. I remember thinking to myself, like, wait a moment, I want to be asking those questions. Like, how could I figure out those? Like, I want those questions to be mine. They're not coming to me, And it's like, why are they not coming to me? And I constantly get into this loop of self-shame, but I'm able to often get myself out of it. But I still like a go-to pattern, So I sort of stopped myself and I said, okay, well, what's the process that I can engage that might get me there? And I used to play chess with my dad when I was younger. And chess is all about pattern recognition, right? And the expert chess players can see like 12, 13, 14 moves ahead compared to the more novice players. And so I started thinking pattern recognition. So the next lecture or seminar that I went to, everybody was focused on what the speaker was saying, but I was focused on something completely different, which is the questions that people were asking at the end of the seminar. And I wrote them all down. And then I went back the next one and wrote them all down, and again. And so after about 5 or 10, I forget the number, I had pages and pages and pages of questions. And I started looking at them, and nothing. I was just sort of looking at them. And then one day I was just looking at them, and boom, I had a light bulb moment. I realized all the questions could actually be categorized into like 4 or 5 categories. Right? So one of them was, does the data that was being presented actually support the conclusions? But as soon as I tapped into those categories, the rationale behind the questions, right? And that really resonated with me, right? Like importance and overstating conclusions, and, like, was the experiment actually working? Did they set it up the right way? Often, if they didn't have the right controls, then it's possible they were generating faulty data and things look really good, but it actually was a problematic experimental setup. So once I realized the rationale, those questions became my questions. So the next seminar that I went to, I was asking the questions that everybody else was asking. And now this connects to creativity, because not only that, now that I was fully engaged, right? So questions allow us, there's an energy associated with questions that actually connects us to other people or other things in a very amazing way, right? A highly energetic way, questions. And so when I started asking questions, all of a sudden I was more engaged, and not only more engaged and more energized, I started to connect the material to other things in my mind. I started to think about the next experiments that person could perform. I started to think about applications of their work, right? And so that was activating my creativity. It's kind of like we need to have engagement. We need to focus our attention, and questions help us to energize our attention.
So how does this show up in your work in the lab? Because you, I feel, have designed some incredible things, like the needle for epidurals that can sense tissues and know when to stop. Do you start with the solution, or do you start with the problem when you're asking questions?
So most of the time we will start with the problem. And I think that another thing about creativity is that it can really come from problem definition. So as we start to define a problem, we're kind of starting to constrain the system. So for example, and I'll just sort of maybe back up and sort of tell you how we define problems, and then I think that this will sort of help to connect in a more linear way with how this leads to creativity in the lab. So let's say we want to work in a particular area, And, one of the areas that we've done a lot of work in is surgical glues, tissue adhesives. There's a lot of problems with suturing and stapling. Sutures are great, staples are great, but if you're working like deep within the body and you have like something you need to many sutures, like a large wound or something, it can take a lot of time. And the longer someone's on the operating table, the greater the risk of complications, for example. And staples can be challenging as well because they're typically like really hard materials. There's a mismatch with the soft tissues in the body, and the tissues can tear and bacteria can get in. So there's all these challenges, And then there's environments where they just don't work. Like in the beating heart, it's really hard to use sutures there or staples, especially for babies or young children, where the hearts are growing. And so there's all these things. So when you start constraining the system and you say, for example, this has to be, any solution we come up with has to be able to be scaled, to hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And so it has to be like cost effective and use materials that the FDA is going to be okay with, and all these things. What that does is that actually piques our curiosity when we start to constrain the system, right? It kind of gives us these constraints that make us like, okay, well, if it has to be constrained with these materials, here's a range of materials that we could use, right? And when things start to be constrained, they become more like tangible. They become more easier to comprehend, like what, if it's just wide open, it's hard to you have to kind of land somewhere, in your mind, and be able to have a framework for advancing. And so that's kind of what happens is we start constraining the system, but that automatically starts generating ideas, because now we start to have more comfort in the approach. Like, it has to be manufacturable. It had the clinical trials to look this way. We have to patent things. And so we start looking in the patent literature, and we identify a space of like, okay, maybe here's things that people have done and here's things that people haven't done. And so maybe we could look there, right? So you start to get ideas of maybe what to do. And so that spurs like creativity. But I'll tell you, the greatest place for creativity ever in the lab is when we start advancing on a project and we fail, we get it completely wrong. It doesn't work. Our ideas don't work. And then all of a sudden we have this like negative sinking, negative emotions. Things are really like not good. It doesn't seem good. Like, it's like, okay, we failed, like maybe we're done. But then what happens is that those emotions, after a few good nights sleep or so, start to fade. And, we're having conversations, we're kind of sitting with it. But then all of a sudden we start thinking like, okay, we start having these very targeted thoughts about where did it go wrong? What might possibly have gone wrong? Are there experts in around us who have expertise we don't have that might be able to look at this and give us some new ideas? Then we bring someone in who hasn't been part of the project, and we sort of explain what happened, and they share some of their ideas. And all of a sudden we're brainstorming again, we're coming up with new ideas, we're creating together, and now we have this another exciting like direction to go. I think our greatest receptivity in life, or one of the areas where we're most receptive, is after a failure or a challenge, because often we've put a lot of effort into something, we've committed, it hasn't gone our way, and now we're like open to new insights in a way that we haven't been before. And that's like an opportunity then that often turns into one of extraordinary creative sort of energy.
Our worth is tied up in our work. And so if I'm trying to accomplish something and I fail, then all of a sudden I feel like I'm not good enough, I'm unworthy. And so it creates this identity or shame cycle of what you were alluding to earlier. So what's your tool to help people get out of that cycle?
To me, one of the ways that I get out of it is really thinking about the evolution. So when I finished writing the book, one of the first things that I did was I got invited to give a talk at Stanford. So I went there, and I had never spoken about the book. In fact, I didn't really tell anybody that I was writing a book. I was basically like writing in the evenings and on weekends and things like that. I mean, I was just really excited about it, but I didn't share it with anybody. And so, but because I didn't share it with anybody, I really didn't have a way of communicating it, because my sort of day job, if you will, is running a research lab and doing research and publishing papers and mentoring students and things like that. And I use the tools in my lab every day, like every moment I'm using the tools, but I'm not necessarily talking about the tools in the sense of how they're described in the book. And so when I got to Stanford to give this talk, it was really the first time that I had to communicate externally all of these concepts in a more sort of didactic way. And when I prepared for it, I was kind of nervous. I showed up and I decided, I was just kind of really nervous, and I decided I would just read off the pages that I had written and try and make it flow. And it was just okay, it was just okay. But there was a moment there where an opportunity for great self-shame to be inflicted, but because I've been in that situation so many times, and in my lab, even one of the things that I do is we're not focused in one particular area. We're focused, what I say, on the process of medical problem solving and applying it to many different problems, constantly evolving, constantly getting into new areas where I'm very vulnerable and need to learn new fields very quickly, kind of thing, or build teams very quickly. So I'm telling you that because I've been in these situations so many times where something doesn't go well, and I start saying like, oh, I could have prepared differently, I could have done this. The way I get out of it is by using this tool, which is to step back and look at it as this is generation 1.0. And there's going to be a 2.0, a 3.0, a 5.0, probably a 20.0, and maybe far beyond, right? And so what I do is, even though I don't feel great about it, I start channeling that energy into the 2.0, because I know I'm going to be talking about this again because I'm really passionate about it. And so what I do is, as I'm delivering this lecture, I'm also receptive to what people are tuning into, to the questions people are asking, and I'm coming up with ideas of how to modify and evolve the presentation. And so to me, that is a tool that allows me to disconnect from the typical self-shame cycle and channel that energy into the next version, the evolution of so sort of recognizing that everything evolves. Again, like we often just see people at the tail, at the end of their success, but we don't see all the learnings and the things that they built and the evolution along the way. And I think that's the tool, is if we can focus more on the evolution.
Have you noticed a pattern in your own? So if you're on a problem and you feel stuck, and then all of a sudden you get the download and you get the breakthrough, have you noticed a pattern in what precedes that? Is it boredom? Is it movement? Is it going into nature? Is there anything that is always present?
In this day and age, I think one of the problems, we have so much information coming at us from every angle, and there's so much stimuli, and we tend to do like back-to-back meetings, or we tend to do meetings and then we're scrolling or watching whatever online, and then another meeting, and so what happens is we're not actually building in time to process information and experiences. Our brains, kind of coming back to this concept we were talking about a little bit earlier, our brains like to feel grounded and like to position information that we're bringing in certain ways in our mind, like into a framework. And if you don't allow that to kind of settle into a certain framework, then you tend not to be able to access it later or use it in a productive, meaningful way. And I think, to me, what I've noticed is when I move, when I cycle, when I walk, even let's say like after a call, or like I have 2 dogs, and so I'm always out like kind of walking them. And I find when I'm moving, it's almost like kind of being in the shower at times. A lot of people talk about great ideas coming in the shower. I find, when I'm walking, just letting my thoughts sort of swirl around. Like, we need to build time in our day for our thoughts to just swirl and sort of find a home in our brains, in our minds. And I have so many failures that I can talk about. Like, when I started my lab, the first 2.5 years, I submitted about 100 grants to try to fund my lab, and almost all of them were rejected, like over 90 of them. And, I went and I gave this TED Med talk in Washington, D.C. at the Kennedy Center, and I got up and forgot my lines like halfway through, and I paused for like 15 seconds. And there were like 5 high definition videos on me, live stream around the world, president of my institution in the room, kind of recovering from that, and applied to medical school. I got rejected from all the schools I applied to. So, there were all these things, but every single time I go back and sort of examine these situations, and it was that ended up being like a pivotal moment in my life where something really amazing came out of it. And again, I think maybe one other thing, just to summarize what I'm saying, is that this receptivity, like tuning into the receptivity that you have after a failure or after a challenge, when the emotions subside. Like if you're high emotions, you're just going to think negative things, so you're not going to be receptive. So a lot of people associate failure challenges with the opposite of not being receptive. But what I've noticed is that it's like the receptivity like skyrockets to a point that I haven't seen in other areas of my life if you wait for those emotions to come down following a failure or a challenge.
We live apart from the rhythms of nature, like we have lights in our house to make it seem like it's sunshine all the time, and we're on our phones, constant information. We don't have that wind down. How have you brought this concept of rhythm into your lab?
Whenever we encounter a failure or a challenge, which happens all the time, by the way, like often, 8 times out of 10 or 9 times out of 10, an experiment will fail. And I think part of it is because I'm so in touch with that rhythm, I know, and just see that pattern all the time. And so when we have a major failure or challenge, I'm able to remain calm, and I feel like when you have somebody that brings that calm to the room and, can kind of say like, all right, everyone, this really sucks. It's not great. And it's sort of like, okay, in the lab, I can say, okay, well, maybe why don't we just take a few days? Why don't we take a week? Why don't we, over the weekend, why don't everyone just sort of think about this and just kind of reflect a little bit, or, or maybe not even, like maybe over the weekend, let's take our minds off of this. Let's just, do something else, right? Like just, or sit with it, whatever sort of, whatever is there for you, like for the individual, because everyone sort of feels it differently and needs to process it differently. So it's sort of like encouraging people to just go through the natural process for them, and then say, okay, like maybe like on Wednesday or Tuesday, whatever it is, why don't we get together and just talk this through, but actually give a period of time, a few days, especially over a weekend, before we come back and reassess. And so that's one of the ways to kind of, build the rhythm in.
Your lab is inspired by nature a lot. And in our culture, I think we extract from nature. We try and just pull from nature. But it really seems like nature is a big part of your team. I'm just curious what started that relationship.
So I developed a really profound, I'd say, connection to nature when I was younger. When I was in the 3rd grade, my family, we moved out to the country. And there was, we were like really out of city limits. There was a farmer's field in our backyard, a sheep farm beside us, buffalo farm across the road. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, there'd be a pack of wolves on my front lawn. And so, we're really out in the country, and there was like my driveway was 1,000 feet long, carved through a forest. And so when I would get off the bus, because then I have to be bused to school, at that time, I was really, I spent a lot of time in the day trying to assimilate, like trying to understand, trying to connect with people, trying to learn how do I fit in. And I would have a lot of shame, back then. And so I'd be ruminating, getting off the bus. And there were no cell phones or anything like that back then. And so I'd be walking along this driveway carved through a forest, and I'd be looking at the trees and I'd be looking at the wildlife. And it just felt like nature was hugging me as I was walking home. Like there was just something that I was connecting to that made me feel comforted. And it didn't make everything go away, but it just felt I don't know, it just really sort of stuck with me. And when I was younger, we would go for drives in the countryside, and like that was one of the things we would do on the weekend, is that everyone would just get in the car and we just go for a drive, like that was sort of the thing, that would bond us together as a family. I think that really sort of, when I moved away from that house, it just, I kind of thought about it a lot. Like it really imprinted in me in a major way. And then in my lab, often we'll turn to nature for inspiration. And to me, I can relive and feel that connection, not only by being in nature, but by sort of researching nature, right? And looking at examples of creatures and how they've evolved and how they've solved problems. And, you can experience awe by being in a forest or on a beach or seeing a sunset, but you can also embrace awe by reading or, watching a documentary or, these other ways of just seeing this incredible innovation in nature and this adaptability and how environments change and creatures adapt, and it's just magical. And so to me, it's another touch point to connect to nature is by making it part of our research. And the other thing is that that's actually a tool in and of itself, turning to nature, because our brains tend to gravitate towards this low energy state. We were hunters and gatherers for tens of thousands of years, and wouldn't have made sense to go for a run, right? Like back at that time, you want to conserve energy in case you have to run away from something or towards something for food or for hunting or whatever it was. And we still have that wiring, and so our brains gravitate and our bodies towards this low energy state, which makes our thinking and our ability to problem solve also tends to gravitate to a low energy state, meaning that we're not coming up with new ideas. We're kind of applying our linear thinking. The way we think about things is an algorithm, like it's very algorithmic. Everybody thinks about, and that's why it's important to collaborate, is because people have different algorithms for how they think and how they approach things. But when we turn to nature for inspiration, it's like we break through all of our algorithms and we are turning to this, evolution as the best problem solver, hundreds of millions of years of research and development all around us. And it allows us to bring like these ideas that we would never have thought of. So it's like a way to pattern interrupt is turning to nature. It's a way to bring in fresh ideas. So it's actually interrupting our sort of normal thinking patterns and this low energy state that we tend to gravitate towards. So it's really a tool in and of itself in turning to nature for inspiration.
Well, do you have any last parting words for us, Dr. Jeff?
The only thing that really is in my mind right at this moment is that I just feel like we have this very powerful biology, right? That's working for all of us, right? Like, just this idea that we don't have to think about breathing when we're asleep. We don't have to think about digestion. We have like all these senses and ways of sort of observing the world and engaging the world, and all these like amazing neurotransmitters that are being released and causing us to feel like in all these different ways. And it just seems to me like as we've moved through sort of history, especially with humans, we tend to associate progress with convenience. Washing machines and dishwashers and microwaves and air fryers and like ability to go on and order food and have it delivered so you don't have to make things. And so we really have this convenience culture that we always are like, we want more time to do the things that we really want to do, but we don't actually think about what are the things that we really want to do with that time and actually carve out that, we've saved so much time, but then we've actually become busier because now there's social media and there's Netflix and Hulu and there's all these things, right, that are like filling the time. So we're filling the time with things that are based on other people's definition of importance, not our own. And to me, it's like that then dulls our ability to tap into our powers of observation and the amazing biology that we have access to. And so we're only using a tiny fraction of it. And to me, it's just, I really think at today's day and age, there's $1 trillion spent every year on marketing and advertising to hijack our attention, to tell us what to buy, what experiences to have, and to serve us someone else's definition of importance that's like fueling others' pocketbooks, right? At our expense, really. And so to me, that's a massive force that we're up against, $1 trillion. And that's psychologically based. Like the major corporations, they know how we're going to think. They know this survival wiring, which is going to dictate how we respond to things. They know that if they keep us in a state of fear, in a state of anxiety, that will be more susceptible to misinformation and manipulation and, all of these things, right? And so to me, it's just so important to recognize that for us, but yet nobody can take away that powerful biology that you have access to within. And so it just, to me, I feel like in this day and age, we all need a strategy in life. We all need tools and practices. We need rituals. We need things that we're experimenting with so we can be hyper aware of the algorithms that are coming at us, that are trying to manipulate us. And we need to spend time to get in touch with our core values and what really is our own definition of importance, and to make sort of have thoughts that connect to that, and then our thoughts then, kind of lead to the actions that become intentional because we're connected to our core wisdom. And, I feel like we're at this age where we're giving up our power. You go on to, for example, a site like YouTube or CNN or whatever, and you're not making a choice. Maybe you made a choice to go to that site, but what's being presented to you is not your choice to consume that. And we need to question, like, is this really serving me? Is this really useful information? Is this really causing me to have anxiety and bring me into negativity? Because often the case is that when we go to these sites, we become more easily manipulated because it puts us in this survival state, this fight or flight state. And so to me, we need strategies and practices and rituals that we can engage so we can be aware of that and start to make more intentional choices. And just one quick example I have, like on YouTube now, I found this little tab or whatever it's called, where when I get to YouTube, it's a blank screen. And then when I type in like something I'm looking for, it doesn't show me any other examples. It just shows me that one video.
I was even reading this morning how processed food dulls your senses and how it's pre-digested, so you never really feel full. It's like why you can eat a bag of potato chips, but if you eat a baked potato, like you're pretty stuffed because it's not pre-digested, right?
To me, like salt is an algorithm, sugar is an algorithm, coffee is an algorithm. That's how I think about it. And the reason why it's an algorithm is because it gets us into a pattern that we repeat over and over again. And it's an algorithm that doesn't serve us, right? Like, so for example, as you just said, there's been studies. I was actually yesterday looking up studies on people who eat potatoes versus if you eat like French fries or potato chips, right? Which are processed and have like salt and fat and stuff. And so what happens is that the salt makes things more palatable. So you end up, you're basically dulling your body's natural intelligence, right? It's intuition. Like if you start eating a potato and you don't put salt on it, you're only going to eat a certain amount because your body's like, I'm good. I don't need more. I'm getting the nutrients from it that I need. Like, okay, give me something else or I'm okay for a while. Whereas if you eat like, if you put salt on it, then you go past the point of where you basically dull your intuition. So you can't tap into your natural intelligence that would tell you to stop. You continue eating it. And in the case of sugar, then what happens is that you get a sugar spike, right? Especially from the processed foods. Then you crash, right? Because you have all this insulin that your pancreas is producing, right? And then that brings the sugar levels way down low. And then now you're low sugar, right? Because it's taken the sugar out of the bloodstream. You have all this oxidative stress and inflammation that's occurring because it's like a rapid response that's like really hard on your pancreas. And so now you're crashing, but the companies are actually programming that crash because they know when you crash, you're going to reach for it again. Right? How do you get out of the crash? More sugar, more salt, more, all these foods. And so I like to think of, like sugar, salt, coffee, all these things are algorithms. And once we start getting in touch with it, we start to realize that we are being manipulated through food, through all means, essentially. And there's an opportunity to break it. And so we may say, okay, well, why stop there? Let's think, okay, how do you break that, right? Because that to me is really where the key is. So one of the ways that I've done that is like, I used to drink coffee and I used to put like sweetener in and like oat milk or whatever, and I just have that every day. And so one of the ways I broke it is I'd say, okay, 1 day or 2 days a week, I'm not going to put sweetener in. I'm just not going to do it. And so to me, I mean, it sounds really simple, it may sound a little silly, but like that's an interception. Like that's intercepting an algorithm, that's intercepting a pattern. And when you do that, it's empowering because you realize that things are changeable. And we have to know that things are changeable to change them. And so once I did that, then I started to realize, wait a moment, I was like going to coffee shops like Dunkin' Donuts or like Blue Bottle Coffee, whatever it was, like every day, like getting coffee, Starbucks. And then I was like, wait a moment, I could make coffee at home. I could, like if there's the 2 dogs, they're at home, like I'm here drinking coffee, like what am I doing? So that was an algorithm. So I stopped doing that and then I stopped coffee, I moved to tea, and then I recently moved to matcha. So that's one of the ways I feel like we can break these algorithms is we just change things up a little bit, right? Like have a meal without salt, have a meal without sugar, like, there's all these, like cut sugar out of something. Because when you start doing that, you open the energetics so that now you can evolve into experimenting and finding patterns that work, like, sort of fit you better, fit your biology, fit your way of being.
Well, amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. It's been an absolute honor chatting with you. Where can our people follow your work? Where can they connect with you?
My website is my name, just jeffkarp.com, and it's Karp. So you can find information about the book Lit there, some things that are not in Lit, some evolution of the Lit tools, as well as my lab work, my research, and the various technologies that we've developed. And then there's also a newsletter that I have that you can subscribe to, and there's a little pop-up for that.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for this amazing conversation.
If you like this episode, share it with a friend. For more conversations filled with awe and wonder, be sure to subscribe to the Vitalist podcasts. Till next time.